The wind in the city was biting that morning, the kind of cold that cuts right through a coat and settles into your bones. Elias stood on the wide pavement outside the massive iron gates of the National Conservatory. He looked up at the building. It was made of heavy gray stone, with tall windows that seemed to look down on him like judgmental eyes. Above the door, carved into the stone, were the names of famous musicians, people who had lived hundreds of years ago. People who wore wigs and silk coats. Elias looked down at his own feet. His boots were thick and leather, made for work, not for walking on polished marble. He looked at his reflection in the dark glass of the gate. He was 30 years old, but he felt older. His face was rough from the weather and his dark hair was messy. Despite his attempts to comb it flat with water in the public restroom down the street, he took a deep breath, his chest expanding under a jacket that had seen better days. He shoved his hands deep into his pockets, trying to hide them, trying to keep the cold air off the knuckles that were always aching. Inside his right pocket, his fingers brushed against a crumpled piece of paper. It was a flyer. Masterclass with Professor Krenz, it read. Open to all serious students. Elias wasn't a student. At least not in the way they meant. He spent 10 hours a day at the steel mill on the edge of the city. He worked near the furnaces, where the air was so hot you could taste the metal. And the noise was a constant deafening ring in your ears. But at night, when the shift was over and his ears were still ringing, he would go to the community center. There, in a dusty basement room, sat an old, out-tuned piano. It was where he went to escape the heat and the noise. He taught himself to play by listening, by feeling the vibration of the strings. He had fallen in love with the piano. But he knew he didn't fit in this world. His friends at the mill laughed at him. Music is for rich people, Elias, they would tell him, slapping him on the back. Stick to the steel. That's where the money is. But Elias couldn't stop. He felt things in the music that he couldn't say with words. And when he heard that Professor Krenz, the most famous pianist in the country, a man known for his strictness and his genius, was coming to give a master class, Elias felt a fire light up inside him. He didn't want a degree. He didn't want a career. He just wanted to know if his music mattered. He needed to know if the sounds he made in that dusty basement were real or just a dream. He walked through the gates. His boots made a heavy thudding sound on the cobblestones, which felt wrong in a place that was so quiet. Students were walking everywhere. They were younger, mostly his age or younger, dressed in long coats, scarves that looked soft, and shoes that shined. They carried instrument cases on their backs, like armor. Elias kept his head down. He could feel them looking at him. He smelled like soap he had washed 3 times before coming, but underneath that, he knew he still carried the faint scent of sulfur and machine oil. It was a smell that didn't wash away easily. He found the administration office. The door was heavy oak. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the brass handle. He looked at his hand again. It was red and chapped. The knuckles were swollen from gripping heavy iron bars all week. His nails were short and broken, stained black at the edges. He quickly pulled his sleeve down over his hand and pushed the door open. The office was warm, smelling of coffee and old paper. Behind a large mahogany desk sat a woman with sharp glasses and a face that looked like it was waiting to be annoyed. She was typing furiously on a keyboard. She didn't look up when the door opened. "I'll be with you in a moment," she said, her voice sharp and clipped. Elias stood near the doorway, not wanting to dirty the clean rug. "Take your time," he mumbled. A minute passed. She finished typing and hit the enter key with a loud click. Finally, she looked up. Her eyes swept over him, starting from his messy hair, moving down to his worn jacket, and stopping at his boots. She didn't smile. "Can I help you?" she asked. It wasn't a question. It was a statement telling him to state his business and leave. "I am here for the application," Elias said. His voice felt small in the big room. "For the Professor Krenz master class." The woman raised an eyebrow. She picked up a pen and tapped it on the desk. "Are you a student here?" "No, ma'am." "Are you from another university?" "No." "Then where are you from?" She looked at his hands, which were gripping the edge of his jacket pockets. "Are you a parent?" "I'm a worker," Elias said, feeling the heat rise in his cheeks. "From the mill, but I play the piano. I want to sign up for the class." The flyer said it was open to serious students. The woman sighed, a long, tired sound that seemed to deflate the air in the room. She stood up and walked around the desk. She crossed her arms. "Look," she said, her voice softening, but becoming more condescending. "We get a lot of people who want to see Professor Krenz. He is a very busy man. This masterclass is for advanced players. People who are planning a career in performance." Elias stepped forward. "I am serious. I practice every day. I have been saving up money for this." "It's not about the money," she said, looking at his rough clothes. "It's about talent and time. Do you know how many years these students have been playing? Since they were 4 years old? They have technique. They have discipline." "I have discipline," Elias said firmly. "I work 10 hours a day, and then I play for 4. Just then, a door opened in the back of the office. A man in a pristine gray suit walked out. He was older, with silver hair combed perfectly to the side. It was the dean of the school. He stopped when he saw Elias. "Is there a problem, Martha?" the dean asked. The secretary turned to him. "This gentleman wants to apply for the master class, Dean. I was just explaining to him that it isn't appropriate." The dean walked over. He didn't look at Elias's face. He looked straight at his hands. Elias tried to hide them, but it was too late. The dean reached out, taking Elias's wrist gently but firmly, and pulled his hand out of the pocket. He stared at the palm. It was mapped with lines of hard skin, white scars from old burns and calluses that were thick and yellowed. These weren't the fingers of a pianist. They were the fingers of a man who wrestled with metal for a living. The dean let go of Elias's hand and took a handkerchief from his pocket, wiping his own fingers as if he had touched something dirty. "See," the dean said to the secretary, though he was looking at Elias with a pity that hurt more than anger. "Music is an art of delicacy. It requires touch, sensitivity." He gestured to Elias's hands. "These hands are designed for labor, for gripping, for holding, for endurance. They are not designed for the piano." Elias felt a lump in his throat, hard and painful. "But I feel the music," Elias said, his voice shaking. "It's in my head. I just need to know if I can get it out." "Music is not just in the head, young man," the dean said, turning back toward his office. "It is in the fingers. And it takes a lifetime to build that connection. You can't just walk in here off the street and expect to compete with people who have dedicated their entire lives to this." He paused at the door, looking back over his shoulder. "I'm sorry," the dean said, but he didn't sound sorry. "You can't do that. The piano requires finesse, not force. There is no place for you here. It would be a waste of our time and yours." "Please," Elias tried one last time. "Just let me try. If I'm bad, I'll leave." "The decision is made," the dean said firmly. "Martha, show him out." Elias stood there for a moment. He felt small. He felt the weight of the mill, the long nights, the cold mornings, the secret hope he had carried in his chest for years all come crashing down on him. The secretary pointed to the door, not unkindly, but she wanted him gone. He turned and walked out of the office. His boots were loud on the floor, but to him, he sounded like a defeat. He walked back through the long hallway, past the practice rooms. He could hear them now, students playing scales, fast and clean, like water flowing. It sounded perfect. It sounded nothing like him. Elias pushed open the heavy front door and stepped back out into the cold wind. He pulled his jacket tighter around himself. The rejection burned in his chest. "You can't do that," the voice echoed in his head. Asterisk, a waste of time. Asterisk, he looked at his hands again. He held them up in front of his face, the rough skin catching the pale sunlight. They were ugly hands. They were workers' hands. But as he looked at them, he remembered the way the piano keys felt under his fingertips. He remembered the vibration that traveled up his arm and into his heart. When he played a chord that was just right, the dean said he didn't have finesse. He said he didn't have the touch. But Elias knew what he had inside. He had fire. He had the sound of the furnaces and the rhythm of the machines. He had a story to tell that wasn't about pretty castles and soft gloves. Elias lowered his hands. He didn't go home. He didn't go back to the mill. He turned and walked toward the side of the massive building. He knew there was a back entrance to the concert hall. He knew the schedule. The open showcase for the master class was in 2 days. If they wouldn't give him a chance, he would take one. He didn't need their permission to sit at a piano. He just needed the music. And he knew, deep down, that if he could just get his fingers on those keys, the music would be louder than their words. It would be louder than their laughter. He walked away from the gate, his stride a little longer, his jaw set tight. The game wasn't over. It was just beginning. The next few days were a blur of fire, steel, and exhaustion. Elias went back to his life at the mill, but something had changed. The rejection he faced at the conservatory didn't make him want to quit. Instead, it lit a fire in him that burned hotter than the furnaces he tended all day. The mill was a place of noise. Giant hammers slammed down on glowing metal, creating a rhythm that shook the floor. The air was thick with dust and the smell of melted iron. Elias wore heavy protective gloves while he worked, gripping the hot steel tongs, guiding the metal from one station to the next. His muscles ached constantly. His back throbbed, and his feet swelled inside his boots. But through the roar of the machines, he heard music in his head. He found himself mentally playing the piano while he worked. When the steam whistle blew to signal a shift change, he didn't just hear a loud noise. He heard a high C note resolving into a chord. The rhythm of the conveyor belt wasn't just machinery to him anymore. It was the beat to a song he was composing when his shift finally ended. The other workers would go to the local bar to drink cheap beer and complain about their bosses. Elias didn't join them. He was too tired for crowds, and he was saving every penny he had. He would grab a quick sandwich from a street vendor, usually just cheese and bread, and walk home in the dark. His apartment was small and cold, located on the top floor of a crumbling building. The windows rattled when the wind blew. But to Elias, it was a palace because it held the piano. It was an old upright model, painted a faded dark red. It had belonged to the previous tenant, and Elias had bought it for almost nothing. The ivory keys were chipped, and some of them stuck when you pressed them too hard. It was horribly out of tune. But it was his. Every night, Elias would sit down at this piano. He would take off his jacket and wash his hands in the small kitchen sink. He scrubbed them with rough soap, trying to remove the layer of grease and dirt that seemed to be a permanent part of his skin now. But the stains on his knuckles wouldn't wash away. The calluses on his fingertips wouldn't soften. He placed his hands on the keys. The pain was immediate. His fingers were stiff from gripping heavy iron all day. The joints protested as he stretched them to reach an octave. He knew that the dean was right about one thing. His hands were not built for this. Playing the piano hurt. It was a sharp, stinging pain in the tendons, a dull ache in the bones. But he played anyway. He wasn't playing the scales that the conservatory students practiced. He wasn't trying to play fast, light runs that sounded like water flowing over stones. He played heavy, loud chords. He played music that sounded like thunder. He found that he could use the weight of his arms to press the keys down, using his shoulders and his back to generate power. He didn't have the delicate touch of a rich kid who had been taking lessons since kindergarten. He had the force of a man who spent his life fighting against metal. He practiced the same song over and over. It was a difficult piece, full of emotion and sudden changes in volume. Sometimes in the middle of a song, a key would stick, and a jarring wrong note would crash out. Elias would stop, his heart sinking. He would curse under his breath and hit the side of the piano, trying to fix the mechanism. "Why are you doing this?" he would ask himself in the empty room. "They told you to stop. They said you were a joke." But then he would remember the look on the dean's face, the look of pity, the way the secretary had looked at his boots. That memory made Elias angry, and the anger helped him push through the pain. He would start playing again, louder this time, letting the music fill the tiny apartment. He played until his eyes burned with exhaustion, until the clock on the wall told him it was 2 o'clock in the morning, and he had to be up at 5 o'clock. 2 days before the showcase, Elias decided he needed to see the hall. He needed to know where he was going. He finished his shift early, and instead of going home, he took the bus across the city to the conservatory. It was evening now. The huge front gates were locked, but Elias knew a side entrance used for deliveries. He saw a truck leaving and slipped in through the open gate before it closed. He kept to the shadows, moving quietly along the brick wall of the building. He found a door that was slightly ajar. It led into a long corridor backstage. The air here smelled of floor wax and old wood. Elias could hear music drifting from the main auditorium. He walked softly, afraid of being caught and thrown out. He reached the heavy velvet curtains that separated the backstage area from the stage. He stood in the darkness behind the curtain and peered out into the vast hall. The auditorium was empty, except for one person. A student was on stage, sitting at a grand piano that gleamed under the spotlight. The student was playing a gentle, complicated melody. It was beautiful. The notes were perfect, clear as glass. The student's hands moved like spiders, darting across the keys with incredible speed. Elias watched in awe. The student was technically perfect. There was no hesitation, no mistake. But as Elias listened, he felt nothing. The music was pretty. Yes. It was like looking at a painting of a flower. It was nice to look at, but it didn't smell like a flower. It didn't have life. It didn't have dirt under its fingernails. Suddenly, a voice came from the back of the hall. "Stop, stop, please." It was Professor Krenz. He was sitting in the last row, hidden in the shadows. The student stopped playing, looking confused. "Professor, did I make a mistake?" "No mistake," Krenz said, his voice echoing in the empty hall. "But it is empty. You are playing the notes, but you are not telling me a story. You are a typewriter, not a poet. Go home. Think about why you are playing." The student gathered their sheet music and rushed off the stage, looking embarrassed. They passed right by Elias without seeing him in the dark wings. Elias froze. He was terrified. He wasn't supposed to be here. He turned to leave, but he bumped into a stack of music stands. They clattered loudly, crashing to the floor. The sound rang out like a gunshot in the silent hall. "Who is there?" Professor Krenz shouted. Elias panicked. He grabbed his bag and ran, pushing through the heavy door and sprinting down the corridor. He didn't stop running until he was out of the building and 2 blocks away, his chest heaving in the cold night air. He hid behind a bus stop bench, his heart pounding. He waited for the security guards to come chasing after him with flashlights. But no one came. He sat on the cold ground, catching his breath. As his heart rate slowed down, he realized something important. He realized that even the greatest students, the ones with perfect technique and fancy clothes, struggled to impress the professor. The professor wanted soul. He wanted a story. Elias looked at his hands again in the street lamp light. They were scarred and swollen. He thought about his life, the long hours, the heat, the loneliness, the struggle to survive. He had a story. He had enough soul to fill that hall 10 times over. He remembered seeing a flyer on the wall backstage. It was the schedule for the showcase day. It said that after the selected students played, there would be a short open session. It was meant for students to ask questions. But Elias looked at the wording. It didn't say only students could ask questions. It just said open session. A plan began to form in his mind. It was a crazy plan. It was a dangerous plan. If he got caught, he would be humiliated, maybe even arrested. But he knew he couldn't walk away now. The dean had told him he couldn't do it. The secretary had told him he didn't belong. But Elias knew that music wasn't about who you were on paper. It was about what came out of the instrument. He stood up from the cold sidewalk. He wasn't just a worker anymore. He wasn't just a dreamer. He was a man with a mission. He turned away from the conservatory and started walking toward the bus stop. He had 2 days left. 2 days to make his hands bleed for the music. 2 days to prepare for the moment he would walk onto that stage and prove them all wrong. He didn't know if he would win. He didn't know if they would even let him finish. But he knew one thing for sure. He was going to play. The big day arrived with a sky so blue it looked fake, but Elias felt like a storm was brewing inside his chest. He stood in front of the mirror in his small bathroom and splashed cold water on his face. He had spent the last 2 days sleeping very little and practicing until his fingers bled. Today, he wasn't going to the mill. He called in sick, something he had never done before. He knew that if he went to work today, he would be too tired to fight the battle that was coming. He put on his best clothes. It wasn't much, just a pair of dark trousers that were slightly too short and a white shirt that he had ironed until the creases were razor sharp. He looked at himself in the mirror. He didn't look like a pianist. He didn't look like an artist. He looked like a man trying to hide who he really was. He combed his hair and looked at his hands. They were clean, but the scars were still there. The skin was still thick and yellow. No amount of soap could change the fact that these were the hands of a worker. He took a deep breath, grabbed his jacket, and walked out the door. The conservatory was buzzing like a beehive. Limousines were pulling up to the front entrance, dropping off important people in expensive suits and glittering jewelry. Elias didn't go to the front gate this time. He knew he would be stopped. Instead, he walked around the block to a side entrance, where a group of tourists was buying tickets for the evening recital. He kept his head down, blending in with a crowd of people who were chatting excitedly about the famous professor. Once inside, the air changed. It smelled of beeswax polish, expensive perfume, and old dust. The lobby was huge, with a ceiling that was higher than the clouds. Chandeliers hung down like giant diamonds, casting a warm glow over everyone. Elias felt out of place immediately. He felt like a speck of dirt on a clean plate. He followed the crowd toward the main auditorium doors. An usher stood there, a young man with a red vest and a bored expression. He checked tickets. Elias didn't have a ticket. His heart hammered against his ribs. He waited for a moment when a large group of people all pushed in at once. He slipped in behind them, keeping his head low, holding his breath. He made it through. The auditorium was massive. It reminded Elias of a cathedral, but instead of an altar, there was a giant black grand piano sitting in the center of the stage. The seats were covered in red velvet, and they were filling up fast. Elias hurried to the very back row. He found a seat in the corner, hidden in the shadows. From here, he could see everything. The audience was not what he expected. He thought it would be full of music lovers. Instead, it looked like a room full of judges. There were men in tuxedos with stern faces, women with fur wraps holding opera glasses, and rows of critics holding notepads. They were sipping wine and whispering to each other, looking around as if they were bored already. Up front, sitting in the front row, was Professor Krenz. He looked smaller in person than he did in pictures, but his presence filled the room. He sat with his legs crossed, looking at his watch, tapping his finger impatiently. Next to him sat the dean. The dean was laughing loudly at something a wealthy woman said, looking very pleased with himself. The lights dimmed. The chatter died down instantly. A hush fell over the room. The first student walked onto the stage. He was a young man, very thin, with perfectly styled blonde hair. He sat at the piano, adjusted his stool, and began to play. It was a Mozart piece. Elias knew it because he had heard it on the radio. It was perfect. The young man hit every note with the precision of a machine. His fingers flew across the keys, barely making a sound when they touched them. Elias listened closely. It was impressive. Yes, it was fast. It was clean, but Elias felt nothing. It was like listening to a robot recite a poem. The notes were there, but the heart was missing. When the young man finished, the audience clapped politely. It wasn't a roar. It was a duty. They clapped because they were supposed to. Professor Krenz didn't clap. He just nodded his head slightly and wrote something on his clipboard. The next student was a girl in a long blue dress. She played a piece by Chopin. She swayed back and forth, closing her eyes, trying very hard to look emotional. The music was soft and pretty, but to Elias, it felt fake. It was like she was acting sad, not actually feeling sad. This went on for an hour. One after another, the students came and went. They were all technically brilliant. They had spent thousands of hours learning how to move their fingers fast. But the energy in the room was getting heavy. The audience was shifting in their seats. The critics were yawning behind their hands. Professor Krenz looked like he wanted to go home. Finally, the last scheduled student finished. The applause was polite, but tired. Then the master of ceremonies stood up at the microphone. "Thank you, students. Now we will move to the open session. This is a time for questions from the audience regarding technique or theory. Please raise your hand." This was it. The moment Elias had been waiting for. His legs felt like lead weights. His hands were shaking so badly he had to grip the armrests of his chair to stop them. He looked around the room. Hands were going up everywhere. People wanted to ask the professor about his fingering method or his opinion on a specific composer. Elias stood up in the back of the dark hall. In his worn-out trousers and work boots, he stood. He didn't raise his hand for a question. He just stood up. The movement caused a ripple. The people sitting near him noticed him first. They pulled their coats away, looking at him with disgust. They saw the scuffed boots. They saw the rough skin on his hands. They smelled the faint scent of metal that still clung to him. "Sir, you have a question?" A man nearby whispered loudly, trying to embarrass him into sitting down. Elias didn't answer. He couldn't find his voice. He just started walking. He stepped out into the aisle. The red carpet ran down the center like a tongue. He took one step, then another. The sound of his heavy boots on the floorboards cut through the silence like a drum. "Hey, you can't go down there?" Someone hissed from the side. More heads turned. The whispers grew louder, spreading like a wave from the back to the front. "Who is that? Is that a janitor? Look at his hands." Elias kept his eyes fixed on the stage. He didn't look left or right. He blocked out their faces. He pretended he was walking toward the furnace at work, focused only on the job. An usher, a young man with a red vest, stepped out from the wall to block him. "Sir, please return to your seat. You are interrupting the event." "I need to play," Elias said. His voice was raspy, dry from fear. The usher laughed nervously. "Play. This is a master class. Sit down," Elias gently pushed past him. He didn't want to hurt the boy, but he wasn't stopping. The usher grabbed his arm, but Elias pulled free with the strength he had learned from lifting steel beams. By now, everyone in the audience was watching. The chatter had stopped. They were shocked. They were witnessing a breach of protocol, a social crime. "Stop him," the dean shouted from the front row. He stood up, his face turning red. "Security. That is the man I told you about. The worker. Remove him immediately." 2 security guards started jogging up the aisle from the front. Elias reached the stage. There were 3 steps leading up to it. They were covered in red velvet. He climbed them. He stood on the stage. The lights were blindingly bright. He couldn't see the audience anymore. He could only feel them. He could feel thousands of eyes burning into him. He could feel the hatred, the confusion, the judgment. He walked toward the piano. It sat there, gleaming black and white. The king of instruments. The dean was running up the side stairs onto the stage now, breathless and furious. "Get off this stage," he screamed, pointing a finger at Elias. "You are a disgrace. You are trespassing." The audience was gasping. It was a scene of chaos. Critics were scrambling to write down what was happening. The security guards were climbing the steps. Elias reached the piano bench. He placed a hand on it. His hand looked alien against the polished wood. The dean rushed toward him, reaching out to grab his shoulder. "Stop!" A voice thundered. It wasn't Elias. It wasn't a security guard. Everyone froze. Even the dean stopped mid-step, his hand inches from Elias's jacket. Professor Krenz had stood up. He walked slowly to the center of the stage. The crowd fell silent. The old man looked at the dean, and the dean immediately lowered his hand, looking sheepish. Then, Professor Krenz turned his gaze to Elias. The professor walked over to him, standing close enough that Elias could see the deep lines in his face. Krenz looked down at Elias's boots. He looked at the torn hem of his trousers. Then, he looked at Elias's hands. The room was so quiet, you could hear a pin drop. The hum of the air conditioning seemed deafening. The professor reached out and gently took Elias's wrist. He turned Elias's hand over, palm up, just like the dean had done in the office. He looked at the scars, the calluses, the broken nails. Krenz didn't wipe his hand on a handkerchief. He didn't look disgusted. He looked fascinated, Krenz said simply. He let go of Elias's hand and gestured to the bench. The dean opened his mouth to protest. But Krenz shot him a look that could have frozen water. Not another word, Krenz said softly. Let us see what he has. Elias looked at the bench. He looked at the keyboard. This was it. There was no turning back. He sat down. The bench creaked under his weight. He lifted his heavy hands and placed them over the keys. The audience held its breath. They were waiting for a joke, a disaster. The first sound that came out of the piano wasn't a note. It was a growl. It was a deep, low rumble that seemed to rise from the floorboards rather than the strings. Elias struck the bass keys with the weight of a falling stone. The sound vibrated through the stage, through the bench, and into the bones of everyone sitting in the front row. For a second, nobody moved. They expected him to fumble. They expected him to play a simple child's tune or bash the keys in anger. But he didn't. His left hand held down a heavy dark chord, while his right hand began to climb up the keyboard. He didn't play like the other students. They had played with their fingers, trying to keep their wrists loose and their touch light. Elias played with his whole body. He leaned into the piano. He used the strength of his shoulders, the strength he used to push steel carts at the mill. He didn't just hit the keys. He sank into them. The melody that emerged was complicated. It wasn't a famous classical piece that everyone knew. It was something Elias had been working on for years in his head. A mix of the noise of the factory and the silence of the night. It sounded like a storm was trapped inside the wood of the piano, trying to get out. The dean, standing off to the side, rolled his eyes. He crossed his arms, waiting for the crashing mistake. He looked at his watch, calculating how long it would take security to drag this man off the stage so the professor could give his final speech. But as the seconds passed, now the dean's arms uncrossed. He looked up. The music was changing. The heavy bass notes were still there, pulsing like a heartbeat, but above them, Elias's right hand was moving with incredible speed. It was a blur of motion. His rough fingers, swollen from labor, were flying over the keys. Because his skin was so hard and calloused, he didn't get the soft, mushy sound a softer hand might get. He got a sharp, percussive attack. Every note rang out like a crystal bell being struck with a hammer. It was aggressive. It was loud. It was frighteningly beautiful. In the audience, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The people who had been whispering and laughing were now dead silent. The critics who had been yawning were now sitting on the edge of their seats. They stopped looking at his boots. They stopped looking at his torn cuffs. They couldn't look away from his hands. They had never seen anyone play like this. Most pianists try to hide the effort. They try to make it look easy. Elias made it look like a fight. It looked like a war between him and the instrument, and he was winning. Sweat was already beading on his forehead. His jaw was clenched tight. You could see the muscles in his neck straining. The music swelled. It sounded like a train rushing through a tunnel. It sounded like rain hammering on a tin roof. It was chaotic, but there was a pattern to it. It was the rhythm of hard work, the rhythm of life. Elias closed his eyes. He forgot about the hundreds of people watching him. He forgot about the dean and the fancy lights. He was back in the basement. He was pouring all his frustration. All the years of being told he wasn't good enough. All the loneliness. Into the piano, he hit a section of the music that required a huge jump from the low end of the keyboard to the high end. He slammed his hand down on the high keys. The sound was piercing, like a scream of triumph. A woman in the third row gasped out loud and dropped her opera glasses. Professor Krenz stood perfectly still. He wasn't looking at his watch anymore. He wasn't looking at the clipboard. He was staring at Elias's hands. For years, the professor had complained that students had cold hands. They played perfectly, but their music had no blood in it. He had shouted at them for months to feel something, to show passion. And here was a man covered in dust and grease, bleeding emotion. The dean's face had gone pale. He realized that the audience wasn't bored anymore. They were mesmerized. He saw the wealthy patrons leaning forward, their mouths slightly open. He saw the famous critics gripping their notepads so hard the paper was crinkling. He realized that he had made a terrible mistake. He had tried to silence a voice that was more powerful than anyone else in the room. The music reached a fever pitch. Elias's hands were moving so fast, they were almost a blur. The sound filled the entire hall, bouncing off the high ceilings, shaking the velvet curtains. It was a wall of sound that washed over the crowd. It wasn't just music. It was a physical force. You could feel it in your chest. Then suddenly Elias cut the volume. The loud, crashing music stopped instantly. He moved to the middle of the piano. He began to play a soft, haunting melody. It was so quiet that the room seemed to hold its breath to hear it. His hands, which had been slamming the keys a moment before, were now barely touching them. It was a gentle, fragile sound. The contrast was shocking. It felt like the quiet after a thunderstorm. It felt like the peace a man feels after a long, hard day's work. He played this soft melody with a tenderness that no one thought was possible for a man with hands like his. He caressed the keys. He treated the piano like a living thing that he was trying to comfort. In this silence, the title moment happened. The room was completely, utterly silent. No one coughed. No one shifted in their seat. No one whispered. There was total quiet. The power of his playing had commanded respect. The snobbery had been beaten out of them by the sheer force of his talent. The professor walked slowly to the edge of the stage. He wanted to see Elias's face. He saw the tears streaming down Elias's cheeks, mixing with the sweat. He saw that the man was gone, lost in the music. The professor realized that this wasn't just a worker playing a trick. This was a genius who had been hidden by the grime of the factory. Flor Elias's hands began to build up the intensity again. The soft notes grew louder. The rhythm returned, faster this time. It was a desperate, driving rhythm. He was playing the final run now. It was a cascade of notes, tumbling down the keyboard like a waterfall. His fingers were hurting. The blisters he had worked over the last few days were bursting, but he didn't care. The pain just made him play harder. He used the pain to add more weight to the keys. He reached the climax. He lifted both hands high above his head, his fingers spread wide. The entire hall leaned forward, waiting for the impact. For a split second, time stopped. Elias was suspended in the air, a silhouette against the bright lights, a man defying every rule they had ever made. He brought his hands down. He didn't just hit the keys. He struck a massive, resonant chord that seemed to shake the foundations of the building. It was a sound of victory. It was a sound of defiance. It was the loudest, most beautiful noise the hall had ever heard. He held the chord. He didn't lift his hands. He pressed down with all his weight, letting the strings vibrate, letting the sound hang in the air like a heavy cloud. He looked up at the ceiling, his mouth open in a silent shout, his fingers buried in the keys. This was the moment where the worker from the steel mill took the grand piano and made it his own. The moment where you can't do that died in the throat of everyone who had ever doubted him. The room wasn't just silent anymore. It was conquered. The final chord hung in the air like a heavy fog. It didn't just fade away. It seemed to soak into the walls, the velvet seats, and the very dust floating in the spotlight beams. Elias sat frozen, his hands still pressed deep into the keys, his body leaning forward over the piano. His chest was heaving, his shirt sticking to his back with sweat. For 5 seconds, there was absolutely no sound. It was the kind of silence that feels loud, a ringing quiet that presses against your ears. The critics, the wealthy patrons, the students, and the staff, all of them, sat motionless. Even the security guards who had run onto the stage stopped in their tracks, forgetting why they were there. Then, a soft click echoed through the hall. Professor Krins had closed his pen. Slowly, the old man stood up. He didn't look at the audience. He looked at Elias. Krenz walked to the center of the stage, right in front of the piano. The dean, who was standing in the wings, with his face pale and his mouth open, took a step forward, as if to intervene, but Krenz raised a hand without looking at him. The dean froze. Krenz waited another moment, letting the silence stretch, letting the brilliance of what just happened sink into everyone's mind. Then he looked down at Elias's hands. He saw the blood on the knuckles where the skin had split, saw the dirt under the fingernails, saw the scars that told the story of a hard life. Finally, Krenz began to clap. It wasn't a polite clap. It was a sharp, rhythmic sound. 1, 2, 3. That sound broke the spell. A man in the 5th row stood up. Then a woman in the balcony. Suddenly, like a wave crashing over the beach, the entire audience rose to their feet. The sound was deafening. It wasn't the polite clapping they gave the other students. It was a roar. People were shouting. A woman in the front row was wiping tears from her eyes with a handkerchief. The critics were throwing their notepads onto the floor, clapping with their hands high above their heads. The noise washed over Elias. He sat up straight, pulling his hands away from the keys. His fingers were trembling uncontrollably now, the adrenaline leaving his body. He looked out at the sea of people. He saw faces that had been full of judgment just 10 minutes ago, faces that were now glowing with awe and admiration. He felt strange. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a heavy weight had been lifted off his shoulders. But at the same time, he felt incredibly exposed. He had poured his soul out in front of strangers, and now he felt raw. Professor Krenz stepped up to the microphone. He didn't need to tap it. The room was already quiet, listening to him. For 30 years, Krenz said, his voice strong and clear, I have been teaching students how to move their fingers. I teach them to play fast. I teach them to play clean. But I cannot teach them what this man just did. He turned to look at the dean, who was shrinking into the shadows. This man did not play the notes, Krenz continued, turning back to the audience. He played the truth. He played the sound of the earth, of labor, of life. You asked for a pianist, and instead, God sent you a poet. The audience roared again. Elias looked down at his boots. He felt his face getting hot. He didn't know how to handle this kind of praise. He was used to being invisible. The guy in the background, the worker. Being the center of attention felt dangerous, like standing too close to the furnace. He stood up slowly. His legs were shaky. He didn't bow like the other students had, with a flourish and a smile. He just stood there for a moment, nodding his head slightly to the room. It was a nod of respect, a way of saying, thank you for listening. He looked toward the wings. The dean was gone. He had slipped away, unable to face the reality that he had been wrong. Elias walked off the stage. As he stepped into the darkness of the wings, the applause got even louder, chasing him like a loving dog. 2 students, the ones who had played perfectly before him, were standing there. They didn't look jealous anymore. They looked humbled. One of them, a young man with a shiny tuxedo, stepped forward. I never knew a piano could sound like that, he whispered. He didn't offer his hand to shake. He just looked at Elias with pure respect. Elias managed a small, tired smile. You have to mean it, Elias said softly. That's all. He walked down the long corridor backstage. His heart was finally slowing down. He passed the security guards, but they didn't stop him. They looked at him with wide eyes, nodding at him as he passed. He walked out the side door of the building and into the cool night air. The city was quiet compared to the roar of the concert hall. Traffic lights changed colors on empty streets. The wind picked up, biting at Elias's face. He realized he was shivering, but it wasn't from the cold. He sat down on a concrete bench near the entrance. He looked at his hands in the streetlight. They were a mess. The skin on his fingertips was bruised and swollen. 2 of his knuckles were bleeding slightly where they had struck the keys too hard. These were the same hands the dean had called useless. These were the hands the secretary had pitied. He flexed his fingers. They hurt. But as he looked at them, he felt a deep sense of peace. He knew that tomorrow he would go back to the mill. He would put on his heavy gloves. He would grip the hot steel. He would clock in and clock out. Nothing about his job would change. But everything had changed. He pulled his jacket tight around him. He didn't need the conservatory to give him a certificate. He didn't need a degree on his wall to tell him he was good. He had heard the applause. He had seen the tears in the eyes of the professor. He had proven, to himself and to everyone else, that art doesn't belong to the rich. It doesn't belong to the people with soft hands and fancy clothes. Art belongs to anyone who is brave enough to bleed for it. Ilya stood up and began the long walk to the bus stop. As he walked, he whistled a quiet tune. It was a simple melody, but it sounded beautiful in the night air. He didn't look back at the grand building. He didn't need to. The music was inside him now, and nobody could ever take that away from him again. The room had been silenced by his fingers, but his heart was singing louder than it ever had before.